Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Picture a narrow ledge of rock jutting from the steep cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey, on the morning of July 11th, 1804. The Hudson River flows dark and silent below. Mist rises from the water, catching the first pale light of dawn. A ferryman rows two separate boats across from Manhattan, each carrying men in long coats, speaking in hushed tones. They land at different points along the shore. The time is shortly after 7 a.m. The air is cool, the sky cloudless. On the dueling ground itself, a small clearing carved from the forest overlooking the water, two men take their positions. Alexander Hamilton, 47 years old, former Secretary of the Treasury, architect of America's financial system, stands with a borrowed pistol in his hand. His face is pale, his jaw set. Across from him, 10 paces away, stands Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States, a man Hamilton has opposed and undermined at every turn for over a decade. The seconds have gone through their careful ritual. They have measured the distance. They have loaded the weapons. They have asked one final time if the quarrel might be settled without bloodshed. Both men have refused. Hamilton wears his spectacles, an unusual choice for a duel. He is asked to test the trigger mechanism, claiming the light is poor. He has aimed his pistol skyward at trees. His second, Judge Nathaniel Pendleton, will later insist that Hamilton never intended to fire at Burr, that his plan was to throw away his shot, to let Burr have his satisfaction without taking his life. Whether this is truth or convenient fiction, we will never know with certainty. What we do know is this. At the signal, Burr raises his pistol with calm deliberation and fires. The shot strikes Hamilton just above the right hip. The bullet enters his body, passes through his liver, fractures his second lumbar vertebra, and lodges in his left side. Hamilton rises on his toes, twists involuntarily. His pistol discharges into the air as he falls. His last words on that ledge before losing consciousness are, "This is a mortal wound, Doctor." He's right. For the next 31 hours, Alexander Hamilton will die slowly in his home on Jane Street in Lower Manhattan, surrounded by his wife Eliza and 7 of their 8 surviving children. His son Philip, who would have been 20 years old, is not there. Philip died 3 years earlier on this same dueling ground, from a wound in the same spot, in a duel fought to defend his father's honour. Hamilton lingers in agony, the bullet wound causing internal hemorrhaging that no medicine of the time can stop. He receives communion from the Episcopal Bishop of New York, though the first priest approached refuses because Hamilton is a known duelist. He dictates messages to his family. He asks repeatedly after Burr, wanting to know if his opponent is safe. He expresses no anger, only regret at leaving his wife and children penniless, and his work unfinished. He dies at 2 p.m. on July 12th, 1804. The most extraordinary immigrant success story in American history ends on a blood-soaked bed, the result of a code of honour that he himself considered barbaric, but felt powerless to refuse. How did this happen? How did a man of such towering intellectual achievement, a founding father who literally wrote the financial architecture of a nation, end his life in a dispute over political insults? How did the boy who arrived in New York as a penniless teenager from the Caribbean, who educated himself, who married into one of America's most prominent families, who became George Washington's most trusted aide, who created the Bank of the United States and the U.S. Mint, who wrote 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers that convinced Americans to ratify the Constitution, how did he throw it all away in a matter of seconds on a New Jersey cliff? The answer is complicated, tragic, and utterly human. It involves pride, ambition, a desperate need for honour, and the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Hamilton's entire life. He was a man of words who lived in an age when words were answered with violence. He was a man who believed in reason, who operated in a political system driven by passion. He was an immigrant who spent his entire life trying to prove he belonged, even unto death. Tonight, we will trace the full arc of Alexander Hamilton's impossible life. From his birth on a forgotten Caribbean island as an illegitimate child with no prospects, through his meteoric rise to become the indispensable right hand of George Washington, through his transformation of America from a collection of bankrupt states into a unified financial power, through his political battles with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, through scandal and loss and the slow unravelling of his influence, to that final morning on the cliff. It is a story of genius and self-destruction, of vision and blindness, of a man who saw the future of his adopted country with perfect clarity, but could not see the trap he was walking into until it was too late. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It is a simple and wonderful way to support this work, and it means a great deal to me. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back more than 2 centuries to a world of sailing ships and handwritten letters, of powdered wigs and dueling pistols, of revolution and nation-building. We will follow Alexander Hamilton from his birth as nobody's son on an island most Americans had never heard of, through the crucible of revolution, into the higher circles of power, and finally to that tragic morning by the Hudson River. It is a story that should not have been possible, yet it happened. And when it ended, America was changed forever. But before Hamilton became a founding father, before he became Washington's aide, before he became a household name, he was simply Alexander, the bastard boy from Nevis and St. Croix, trying to survive. His story begins not in triumph, but in shame. In the year 1755, the island of Nevis in the British West Indies was a green jewel of volcanic peaks and sugar plantations floating in the Caribbean Sea. The island rose from the turquoise waters like a perfect cone, its central peak, Nevis Peak, reaching over 3,000 feet into clouds that seemed perpetually to crown its summit. The British called it Nevis, from the Spanish Nuestra Señora de las Nieves, Our Lady of the Snows, because Columbus thought the white clouds resembled snow on a mountain. It was 36 square miles of brutally efficient capitalism, built on the backs of enslaved Africans who outnumbered white colonists by ratios of 10 to 1 or higher. The air smelled of cane smoke from the grinding mills that operated day and night during harvest season, salt from the ocean that surrounded the island on all sides, and the peculiar rot of tropical abundance, fruit falling from trees to ferment in the heat, vegetation growing so fast you could almost watch it spread. The island was wealthy, at least by Caribbean standards, wealth measured in hogsheads of sugar and barrels of rum. Sugar made fortunes for those who owned land and people. The plantation owners lived in great houses with wide verandas designed to catch the trade winds, surrounded by gardens of hibiscus and bougainvillea. They dressed in the latest London fashions despite the heat, powdered their wigs, and pretended they were civilized English gentlemen rather than colonists living on the edge of the world sustained by brutality. For everyone else, for the enslaved Africans who worked the cane fields from dawn until darkness fell, for the poor whites who owned no land and worked as overseers or clerks or shopkeepers, for the mixed-race population that existed in the social netherworld between free and enslaved, it was a place of grinding poverty, suffocating heat that could kill through simple exhaustion, and yellow fever that arrived on ships from other islands and killed indiscriminately, taking rich and poor, white and black, sparing no one. The society of Nevis was rigidly stratified. At the top were the major plantation owners, perhaps 24 families who controlled most of the island's wealth, and all of its political power. Below them were the lesser planters, small holders with a few dozen acres and a handful of enslaved workers, men trying to claw their way into the planter class. Below them were the merchants and professionals, the doctors and lawyers who served the plantation economy. Then came the poor whites, the failed plantation owners, the younger sons of good families who had no inheritance, the clerks and shopkeepers struggling to maintain respectability. And at the bottom, making up the vast majority of the island's population, were the enslaved Africans who made all of this possible through forced labour in conditions that broke bodies and shortened lives to decades or less. Into this world of stratified privilege and systematic oppression, into this small island where everyone knew everyone else's business and your social position determined whether you lived or died, Alexander Hamilton was born. The circumstances of his birth placed him in the worst possible category, below even the poor whites, because he was not just poor, he was illegitimate. Into this world on January 11th, 1755, or possibly 1757, the exact year remains disputed by historians who have passed church records and legal documents, trying to fix the date with certainty. Alexander Hamilton was born. His mother was Rachel Fawcett Lavian, a woman of French Huguenot descent whose own life reads like a Gothic novel of misfortune, survival, and stubborn independence. Rachel had been born on Nevis around 1729 to John Fawcett, a Huguenot planter of modest means, and Mary Uppington Fawcett, a woman from an established island family. The Fawcetts were respectable, but not wealthy. John Fawcett owned land and enslaved people enough to make a living, but not enough to be considered part of the planter elite. When he died in 1745, he left Rachel and her mother and sister in difficult circumstances. Mary Fawcett, widowed with limited resources and daughters to provide for, did what women in her position typically did. She arranged marriages. Rachel, described in contemporary accounts as beautiful, with dark hair and eyes, and a temperament that mixed charm with willfulness, was 16 years old when she was married off to Johann Michael Lavian, a Danish or possibly German merchant who lived on the island of St. Croix, another jewel in the Caribbean archipelago, this one controlled by Denmark rather than Britain. Lavian was significantly older than Rachel, already established in the merchant trade dealing in sugar, rum, and slaves. The marriage was a disaster from its beginning. Lavian was controlling to the point of tyranny. He managed every aspect of Rachel's life, controlled her movements, her money, her contacts with family. Whether he was physically abusive, the historical record does not say explicitly, but the pattern of his behaviour suggests a man who believed his wife was property to be managed like his other possessions. Rachel was spirited, independent, and deeply unhappy. She bore Lavian a son, Peter, around 1746, but the marriage could not hold. The details are murky, preserved only in legal documents filed in the Danish courts of St. Croix that describe the breakdown in dry legal language that conceals whatever actual suffering occurred. What is clear is that Rachel attempted to leave Lavian multiple times, and each time Lavian used the full force of Danish law to control her. In 1749, when Rachel was about 20 years old and had been married for 4 years, she left Lavian and returned to her family on Nevis. Lavian responded by having her arrested and imprisoned. Under Danish law of the time, a husband had the right to have a disobedient wife detained for desertion. Rachel spent several months in the fort at Christiansted, St. Croix, held in a cell, legally imprisoned for the crime of leaving her husband. When she was finally released, rather than returning to Lavian, Rachel fled. She went back to Nevis and never saw Lavian or her son Peter again. She abandoned everything, her possessions, her child, her legal status as a married woman, to escape a marriage that had become unbearable. On Nevis, living with her mother and sister in reduced circumstances, socially compromised by her failed marriage and imprisonment, Rachel met James Hamilton. And it is here that Alexander's story truly begins, though in another sense, the catastrophe of Rachel's first marriage is where Alexander's story really starts, because it determined his legal status for his entire life. James Hamilton was a Scottish nobleman's fourth son, which meant he carried one of the most respected names in Scotland, the Hamiltons of Camberskeith in Ayrshire, descended from ancient nobility, but possessed literally nothing else. In the rigid hierarchy of Scottish aristocracy, the eldest son inherited the title and estates. The second son might get a smaller property or a position in the church. The third son might enter the military or law. The fourth son was expected to make his own way in the world, with nothing but his name and his education. James Hamilton had arrived in the Caribbean sometime in the 1740s, part of that wave of younger sons of good families who went to the colonies seeking fortunes they could never make at home. He had education, good manners, the ability to discuss literature and philosophy, and a talent for business so poor it verged on spectacular. Contemporary accounts and his own letters describe a man of fine appearance and courtly bearing who could not hold a job, could not manage money, could not complete any commercial venture successfully. He tried trading in various commodities, acting as a factor for Scottish merchants, managing plantation supplies. Everything he touched failed, not through lack of effort, but through some fundamental inability to understand how commerce actually worked. He had the temperament of a gentleman scholar misplaced into the rough commercial world of Caribbean trade. Rachel, still legally married to Lavian and thus unable to marry James Hamilton under any law, Christian or civil, became his common law wife sometime around 1750 or 1751. This was scandalous enough. A woman living with a man not her husband, in a society where respectability was everything, and where your social position determined your survival, was effectively casting herself out of polite society. But the situation grew immeasurably worse. In 1759, Johann Michael Lavian, enraged by Rachel's relationship with Hamilton and by her refusal to return to him, sued for divorce in the Danish courts of St. Croix. The divorce decree, filed and preserved in the Danish archives, is a document of remarkable cruelty. It granted Lavian the divorce on grounds of Rachel's adultery, whoredom, and desertion. It stripped Rachel of all property she might have claimed from the marriage. Most devastating, it included a specific provision stating that Rachel was forbidden from ever remarrying, that she had forfeited this right through her behaviour, and that any children she might have from her adulterous relationship with James Hamilton were to be considered illegitimate bastards with no right to inherit property from either parent. This was not merely a divorce. It was a legal curse upon Rachel and any children she might bear, a deliberate and malicious destruction of their future prospects under law. Alexander Hamilton and his older brother James, Jr., born around 1753, were born into this legal and social no-man's land. They were not just poor, they were bastards, a term that in the 18th century Caribbean carried the full legal and social weight of exclusion from civil society. They could not inherit. They could not hold public office in most colonies. They were, in the eyes of the law and society, nobody's legitimate children. The small family, Rachel, James Hamilton, and their 2 boys, moved restlessly through the Leeward Islands over the next decade, chasing James Hamilton's perpetually failing business ventures. From Nevis they moved to St. Kitts, then to Christiansted on St. Croix, the largest of the Danish Virgin Islands, a thriving port where ships from every European nation traded sugar, rum, slaves, and manufactured goods in a babel of languages and currencies. James Hamilton tried selling goods on commission, attempting to establish trade routes between the islands and ports in Scotland and England. acting as a factor for European merchants who needed local representatives. Every venture collapsed under the weight of his impracticality, his inability to manage accounts, his tendency to extend credit to people who would never pay, his failure to understand that in the rough commercial world of Caribbean trade, a gentleman's word meant nothing without money to back it. They lived in modest quarters in Christiansted, a mixed neighbourhood of merchants, sailors, freed people of colour, and white colonists of middling rank, never starving but never secure, always one failed venture away from total destitution. The household spoke a mixture of English, the language of James's Scotland and the British Islands, and French, which Rachel spoke fluently from her Huguenot heritage, and which was also widely spoken in the polyglot Caribbean. Young Alexander absorbed both languages as a small child, switching between them naturally depending on whether he was speaking with his father or his mother. Rachel, who had received an education unusual for a woman of her time and place, taught her sons to read in both languages. She owned a small collection of books, perhaps 36 volumes gathered over years, treasured possessions in a world where books were expensive and rare. The collection included works by Alexander Pope, whose polished heroic couplets and moral poetry were popular throughout the English-speaking world. Plutarch's Lives in English translation, describing the great men of ancient Greece and Rome, the complete works of Racine in French, religious texts including a French Bible, and various other volumes of poetry and philosophy. These books became young Alexander's window into a world far beyond the cramped rooms and limited horizons of Caribbean colonial life. He read voraciously from the age of 5 or 6 once he had mastered the mechanics of reading. He would take a volume and retreat to a corner, sitting on the floor with the book in his lap, mouthing the words as he read, memorizing entire passages. Pope's essay on man, with its confident assertion that order is heaven's first law, and its exploration of humanity's place in the divine scheme, shaped his understanding of natural philosophy. Plutarch's descriptions of ancient statesmen and warriors, comparing Greek and Roman heroes, showing how character determines destiny, gave him models of greatness to aspire to. His brother James, Jr., 2 or 3 years older, depending on which birth date for Alexander is correct, was a different type of child altogether. James was more physical, robust, content to play in the streets of Christiansted with other boys, swimming in the harbour where the clear Caribbean water was so transparent you could see fish swimming 15 feet down, climbing trees, engaging in the rough games that boys played. Alexander was slight, pale despite the tropical sun, thin to the point where adults worried about his health, and bookish to a degree that marked him as odd. He had red hair, described by those who knew him as auburn or chestnut, unusual in a place where most people were dark-haired, and light eyes, either blue or violet depending on who described them, sometimes appearing almost lavender in certain light. He was small for his age, delicate in build, almost fragile in appearance. But behind those light eyes was a mind that absorbed everything, retained everything, connected everything. He would read a passage from Plutarch about Demosthenes forcing himself to overcome a speech impediment, and he would recite it from memory weeks later. He would hear adults discussing exchange rates between different currencies, Spanish dollars and English pounds and Dutch guilders, and he would calculate conversions in his head faster than they could check with pencil and paper. He noticed patterns, connections, the underlying principles that others missed. When Alexander was about 10 years old, disaster struck. James Hamilton abandoned the family. The exact reasons remain unclear. Some accounts suggest business debts had become too great. Others hint that he felt the shame of his situation too keenly to continue. Whatever the reason, one day James Hamilton simply left St. Croix and never returned. He drifted through the Caribbean for the rest of his life, a failed gentleman living on the charity of relatives and friends. He and Alexander would exchange letters for years, but they would never see each other again. Rachel was now alone with 2 illegitimate sons and virtually no resources. Fortunately, she had inherited a small sum from her own father, just enough to rent a modest house in Christiansted and open a small provision store on the ground floor. She sold food, clothing and household goods to sailors and townspeople. It was humble work, socially a step above nothing, but it kept the family alive. Alexander, now about 11 years old, helped his mother in the store. He learned to keep accounts, to calculate exchange rates between different currencies. The Caribbean trade involved English pounds, Spanish dollars, Dutch guilders, and he learned to deal with the sailors and merchants who were the store's clientele. These men spoke of ports across the Atlantic, of New York and Boston, of London and Amsterdam. They brought newspapers months old that Alexander would read cover to cover, learning about the wider world, about politics and wars and ideas. He was absorbing a commercial education that would later prove invaluable. But this fragile existence was about to shatter completely. In February of 1768, when Alexander was either 11 or 13 depending on which birth year is correct, both he and his mother fell desperately ill with a violent tropical fever, likely yellow fever or dengue. They were bedridden in their small house, sweating through the fever in the same bed. A local doctor was called. He administered what treatments were available: bloodletting, purgatives, rest. Alexander, younger and stronger, survived. Rachel did not. On February 19th, 1768, Rachel Fawcett Lavian died, leaving her 2 sons orphans with literally nothing. The probate court of St. Croix seized everything Rachel owned to settle her debts. Her first husband's son, Peter Lavian, the half-brother Alexander barely knew, appeared to claim whatever remained, citing the divorce decree that barred Rachel's illegitimate children from inheriting anything. The court agreed. The books Rachel had owned, the books that had been Alexander's education, were sold at auction. The furniture, the inventory from the store, everything was liquidated. Alexander and James Jr. were left with the clothes they wore. Alexander Hamilton was now an orphan, a bastard, and utterly destitute on an island where your social position determined whether you lived or died. He was barely a teenager, and he had nothing. No family, no money, no prospects, no legal right to anything. Most boys in his position would have ended up as labourers or sailors, if they survived at all. But Alexander had something that could not be auctioned away or stolen by half-brothers. He had an extraordinary mind, and he was about to prove it. The death of his mother marked the end of Alexander Hamilton's childhood and the beginning of his long, grinding struggle to escape the cage of his birth. In the months after Rachel's death, Alexander and his brother were separated. James, Jr., the older and more physically robust, was apprenticed to a carpenter, a practical trade that would give him a living if not a future. But Alexander, slight and bookish and clearly unsuited for physical labour, needed different placement. Through a network of charity and family connections, he was taken in by a merchant named Thomas Stevens, who lived in Christiansted with his family. This was not adoption, or even formal guardianship. It was more like boarding. Stephen saw potential in the boy, or perhaps he simply took pity on him. Whatever the reason, Alexander was given a place to sleep and helped in Stevens's import-export business. This placement would prove transformative. Thomas Stevens had a son, Edward, who was exactly Alexander's age. The 2 boys looked so similar that rumours circulated for years that Alexander might actually be Stevens's illegitimate son, making Edward his half-brother rather than his friend. There is no evidence to support this claim, but it persisted because the resemblance was uncanny, and because Stevens took unusual interest in Alexander's welfare. Regardless of biology, Alexander and Edward became close. Edward Stevens would later become a physician and remain Alexander's friend and correspondent for decades, one of the few people who knew Hamilton before he became Hamilton. But the most important connection Alexander made in these years came through another merchant, Nicholas Kruger, who hired the teenage boy as a clerk in his trading house. Kruger was young himself, only in his mid-20s, but already running a substantial commercial operation that traded goods throughout the Caribbean and with merchants in New York. Kruger's firm imported flour, timber, horses, and mules from North America and exported sugar, rum, and molasses to ports across the Atlantic. The job required literacy, numeracy, attention to detail, and the ability to deal with ships' captains, customs officials, and other merchants. Alexander excelled immediately. He was given responsibility for managing accounts, writing correspondence, and evaluating shipments. His letters from this period survive, and they reveal a teenage boy writing with the authority and precision of a seasoned merchant. "Sir," he writes to one ship's captain who had delivered inferior goods, "the flour you sent is of such poor quality that it cannot be sold at any reasonable price. I have refused to accept delivery and must ask that you return with goods of the contracted standard." He was perhaps 14 years old when he wrote this, yet he sounds like a man of business with decades of experience. In 1771, when Alexander was about 14 or 16, Kruger had to travel to New York for health reasons and left the entire St. Croix operation in the boy's hands. For 5 months, Alexander Hamilton ran a major Caribbean trading house alone. He negotiated with ships' captains over freight rates. He extended credit and called in debts. He managed a workforce of enslaved people and free labourers. He dealt with a crisis when a shipment of mules arrived in terrible condition and successfully argued for compensation. The correspondence from this period astonishes modern historians. This teenage boy, legally a bastard with no formal education, no family name, and no resources, was conducting international commerce with absolute confidence. He was calculating currency exchanges, managing complex credit arrangements, and writing with the formal precision of a trained businessman. Where had he learned all this? From observing, from reading, from sheer force of intellect. But commerce, however successful he was at it, was not what Alexander's mind craved. In his few spare hours, he read everything he could find. He studied accounts of history and military campaigns. He read political philosophy, economics, and literature. He taught himself Latin well enough to read Cicero. He wrote poetry, romantic verses in the style of Pope, full of classical allusions. He was not content to be a successful clerk. He wanted to be educated, to be a gentleman, to be someone who mattered. The turning point came on the night of August 31st, 1772. A massive hurricane, one of the most violent storms in Caribbean history, struck St. Croix. For 6 hours, winds of unimaginable force tore across the island. Buildings collapsed. Ships in the harbour were lifted and thrown onto the shore. Trees were ripped from the ground. The sugar mills were destroyed. When dawn came, the island was devastated. Dozens were dead, hundreds were homeless, and the economic infrastructure of St. Croix had been shattered. Hamilton, who had survived the storm in a stone building that shook but did not collapse, sat down and wrote a description of what he had witnessed. The letter, addressed to his father but clearly meant for a wider audience, was a remarkable piece of writing. It combined vivid sensory description with moral and theological reflection. "Good God," he wrote, "what horror and destruction! It is impossible for me to describe it or for you to form any idea of it. It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. the roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into angels. He went on for nearly 1,000 words, describing the aftermath, the suffering of the injured, the destruction of property. But then he pivoted to philosophy. Where now, O vile worm, is all thy boasted fortitude and resolution? What is become of thy arrogance and self-sufficiency? It was Baroque, overwritten in the style of the time, full of classical rhetoric. But it was also powerful. This was not the writing of a teenage clerk. This was the work of an educated mind grappling with catastrophe. Someone, probably Thomas Stevens, sent the letters to the Royal Danish American Gazette, the local newspaper. It was published on October 3rd, 1772. The response was immediate. Who was this boy who could write like this? How had such talent remained hidden in a clerk's position? A group of St. Croix merchants and planters, impressed by the letter and aware of Hamilton's circumstances, decided to do something extraordinary. They pooled their money to send Alexander Hamilton to North America for an education. The precise details of who contributed and how much remain unclear. The traditional story says it was a community fund, though some historians believe Kruger and Stevens bore most of the cost. What is certain is that in October of 1772, shortly after his 15th or 17th birthday, Alexander Hamilton boarded a ship bound for New York with letters of introduction, a small sum of money for expenses, and instructions to seek admission to the College of New Jersey, today's Princeton University. He left behind the Caribbean, his brother James, whom he would never see again, the world of his mother's tragedy and his father's failure. He was going to America as a charity case, a bright boy that merchants hoped might make good with an education. He had no illusions about his situation. He knew he was nobody, that he had no family name to open doors, that he would have to prove himself through sheer ability. But he also knew something else. He had survived things that would have broken most people. He'd been orphaned, destitute, abandoned. He had watched his mother die and had everything taken from him. And yet here he was, on a ship to New York, carrying letters that praised his genius, heading toward a future that 1 year earlier would have been unimaginable. The ship sailed north through Caribbean waters into the Atlantic, carrying a teenage boy who would help invent a nation. But first he would have to invent himself. Alexander Hamilton arrived in New York Harbor in the autumn of 1772, possibly late October or early November, aboard a ship that had taken weeks to make the voyage from St. Croix. The city that greeted him bore little resemblance to the metropolis it would become. New York was home to perhaps 25,000 people, clustered at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. The streets near the harbour were cobblestone, crowded with carts and horses and merchants hawking goods. The air smelled of the sea, of fish markets, of the privies that emptied into open gutters. Buildings were mostly wooden, 2 or 3 stories tall, with a few imposing structures like Trinity Church defining the skyline. This was still very much a colonial city, provincial compared to London or even Philadelphia, but bursting with commercial energy. Hamilton, arriving with his small trunk of clothes and his letters of introduction, would have been immediately struck by the cold. He'd spent his entire life in the tropics. The November air of New York was a shock, the first hint of winter that he had never experienced. He wore clothing unsuited for the climate and spoke with a slight accent, the rhythm of the Caribbean still in his voice. He was small, perhaps 5'7", thin, with reddish hair that he would later powder in the fashion of the time, and those remarkable light eyes that people who met him always commented on. They were described variously as blue, violet, or even lavender, eyes that seemed to see through you. He took lodgings in a boarding house and immediately set about following his instructions. He was to enroll in a preparatory academy to complete his education, and then seek admission to the College of New Jersey at Princeton. The Presbyterian minister Francis Barber ran an academy in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, across the harbour from New York, and it was there that Hamilton enrolled in early 1773. He was older than most of the other students, probably 16 or 18, but his education had enormous gaps. He had read widely but irregularly. He could read Latin, but his Greek was weak. His mathematics was commercial rather than theoretical. Barber, recognizing the boy's extraordinary native ability, agreed to tutor him intensively. For the next year, Hamilton studied with manic intensity. He slept little, 4 or 5 hours a night, a pattern that would persist his entire life. He would pace while studying, reciting passages aloud, arguing with himself in Latin. The other students found him odd but brilliant. He could master material in a fraction of the time it took others. Within months he had filled the gaps in his education and was ready to apply to college. Hamilton's first choice was the College of New Jersey, today Princeton. He travelled there in late 1773 to interview with the president, John Witherspoon. Hamilton made an unusual request. He wanted to be admitted with the freedom to advance through classes at his own accelerated pace, rather than following the standard 4-year curriculum. He argued that his circumstances required rapid completion. The money supporting him was limited. He needed to complete his education and begin supporting himself as quickly as possible. Witherspoon, impressed by the young man's ability but troubled by the irregular request, consulted with the college trustees. They refused. The curriculum was fixed. Hamilton would have to proceed at the standard pace or not at all. Stung by the rejection but undeterred, Hamilton turned to King's College in New York City, today's Columbia University. King's College was smaller than Princeton and more closely tied to the Anglican establishment, but it was also more flexible. The president, Miles Cooper, interviewed Hamilton and was sufficiently impressed to admit him with the understanding that he could study at his own pace. In late 1773 or early 1774, Hamilton enrolled as a private student, meaning he attended classes but was not yet formally matriculated. He threw himself into the curriculum with characteristic intensity, studying mathematics, natural philosophy, rhetoric, and Latin. He joined the Corsican Society, a student debating club. He began writing essays on political topics, testing his ideas in the relatively safe space of academic argument. But the world outside King's College was about to explode. In December 1773, American colonists in Boston dumped British tea into the harbour to protest the Tea Act. Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts, closing Boston Harbour and tightening control over Massachusetts. Throughout the colonies, political tensions that had been simmering for a decade suddenly reached a boiling point. In New York, public meetings were held to debate the appropriate response. Should the colonies resist or submit? Should they organise a congress to petition the king? Should they prepare for war? Hamilton, barely arrived in the colonies and still technically a student, found himself drawn into the ferment. In July 1774, a large public meeting was held in the fields outside the city to discuss New York's response to the Coercive Acts. Thousands attended. Speakers rose to address the crowd, arguing various positions. At some point during the meeting, Hamilton, who had been listening from the crowd, stood on a platform and began to speak. He was 17 or 19 years old, a nobody from the Caribbean with no standing to address the gathering. Yet once he began to talk, the crowd fell silent. Witnesses later recalled that he spoke extemporaneously for over an hour with remarkable fluency and logical precision, arguing for measured resistance to British overreach while maintaining loyalty to the Crown. It was his first public speech, and it announced the arrival of a new voice in American political life. Over the next year, as the colonies moved toward open conflict, Hamilton wrote a series of pamphlets defending American rights while trying to chart a moderate course. His first major work, A Full Vindication of the Measures of the Congress, was published in December 1774 when he was still a student. It was a 35-page response to Tory arguments against the Continental Congress. The writing was sophisticated, legally argued, and utterly confident. Readers assumed it was the work of an experienced lawyer or statesman. When people learned it was written by a teenage college student, the response was amazement. Who was this Hamilton? Where had he come from? How had no one heard of him before? The answer, of course, was that he was a nobody trying to become a somebody through sheer force of intellect and will. He followed the vindication with an even longer work, The Farmer Refuted, in February 1775, an 80-page demolition of loyalist arguments. He was teaching himself law, teaching himself political philosophy, teaching himself to write for public consumption, all while ostensibly studying at King's College. In April 1775, violence erupted at Lexington and Concord. British troops marching to seize colonial military stores were met by armed militia. Shots were fired, men died, and the American Revolution began. New York, with its large loyalist population and strategic position, was immediately thrown into chaos. Would the city side with the rebels or the crown? Hamilton didn't hesitate. Despite his earlier calls for moderation, once blood was shed, he committed fully to the revolutionary cause. He joined a volunteer militia company called the Corsicans, later renamed the Hearts of Oak, drilling on the common with other students and young men. He was made an artillery captain, though he knew nothing about artillery. He threw himself into learning the mathematics of ballistics, the logistics of moving cannon, the tactics of artillery deployment. Within months, he had made himself into a competent artillery officer through the same method he had used for everything else: obsessive study and relentless practice. As 1776 dawned, Hamilton was no longer a student. He was a soldier in a revolutionary army, commanding an artillery company in defense of New York. He was 19 or 21 years old. He had been in America for barely 3 years. Yet already he was making himself indispensable through competence, through writing, through the sheer force of his intelligence. But he was still unknown outside New York, still a minor figure in a revolution led by men of wealth and established reputation. That was about to change. In the summer of 1776, as the Continental Army prepared to defend New York against a massive British invasion, a young artillery captain was about to meet the man who would transform his life. The meeting between Alexander Hamilton and George Washington did not happen in a single moment, but unfolded gradually over the course of a catastrophic military campaign. In July 1776, as the newly declared United States of America prepared to defend New York City, Washington commanded an army of about 20,000 men facing a British force of over 30,000 regulars, supported by the most powerful navy in the world. Hamilton's artillery company was positioned in Manhattan, tasked with defending key positions against the expected invasion. The Battle of Long Island in late August 1776 was a disaster for American forces. The British outflanked and nearly destroyed Washington's army. The retreat across the East River in the middle of the night, with Hamilton's company covering the withdrawal with their guns, was a masterpiece of desperate improvisation that saved the army from total annihilation. Hamilton and his men were among the last to cross, firing at shadows in the dark to convince the British that positions were still defended. Over the next months, as Washington's army retreated through Manhattan, across New Jersey, and finally into Pennsylvania, Hamilton's artillery company fought in every major engagement. At Harlem Heights, his guns provided crucial cover. At White Plains, he commanded a battery that held its position under heavy fire. At the disastrous fall of Fort Washington, his company was one of the few units that escaped capture. Washington began to notice the young captain. Hamilton was everywhere, his artillery always positioned correctly, his men disciplined despite the chaos. But more than his military competence, it was Hamilton's intellectual ability that impressed Washington. After actions, Hamilton would write detailed reports that analysed what had gone wrong and what might be done better. His writing was clear, precise, and strategic. He thought like a staff officer, not just an artillery captain. Washington's need was acute. Running an army in the field required enormous amounts of correspondence. Letters had to be written to Congress begging for supplies, to state governors requesting militia, to other generals coordinating movements, to officers giving orders. Washington needed aides de camp who could draft these letters, men who could think strategically and write with authority in the general's name. Good aides were rare. They needed education, judgment, discretion, and the ability to work under enormous pressure. In early 1777, Washington's staff was exhausted and inadequate for the growing demands. Several generals recommended young Hamilton to Washington as a potential aide. The general invited him to headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey in late January. The interview lasted several hours. Washington probed Hamilton's background, his education, his political views. Hamilton, who had nothing to lose, spoke with characteristic directness. He wanted to contribute to the cause at the highest level. He believed in the revolution not as a colonial rebellion, but as the foundation of a new kind of nation. He could write, he could think strategically, and he would work as hard as necessary. Washington offered him a position as lieutenant colonel and aide-de-camp on the spot. Hamilton accepted immediately. On March 1st, 1777, at age 20 or 22, Alexander Hamilton joined George Washington's official military family as his primary aide. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, the chance to move from obscurity to the centre of power. For the next 4 years, Hamilton would be Washington's right hand, his translator, his confidant, and in many ways his surrogate son. The job was grueling. Hamilton worked from dawn until late into the night, often sleeping only 4 or 5 hours. He sat at a desk in headquarters, wherever that happened to be, drafting letters in Washington's name. The general would give broad instructions, write to Congress and explain why we need winter supplies, and Hamilton would compose the letter, capturing Washington's voice while adding his own strategic arguments. Washington would review the drafts, make minor changes, and sign them. The volume was staggering. During Hamilton's 4 years as aide, he drafted thousands of letters, orders to field commanders, reports to Congress, diplomatic correspondence with the French, circular letters to the states, detailed analyses of military strategy. He became, in effect, Washington's primary means of communicating with the world. But before we continue with the arc of Hamilton's public achievements, we must pause to understand who this man actually was when he was not drafting legislation or writing treatises on national finance. What did Alexander Hamilton look like? How did he move through the world? What were his habits, his quirks, his daily routines? These details matter because they reveal the human being beneath the historical figure, the man whose personality shaped how he wielded power and ultimately how he lost it. Hamilton, in his physical prime, during his 30s when he was Treasury Secretary and at the height of his influence, was not an imposing figure. He stood perhaps 5 feet 7 inches tall, possibly an inch taller or shorter, depending on which contemporary account you trust, making him shorter than Washington, Jefferson, Madison, most of the men he worked alongside. His frame was slight, almost delicate. He weighed perhaps 140 pounds, thin in a way that suggested nervous energy rather than athletic build. His hair, which had been reddish auburn in youth, he powdered white in the fashion of the time, though some accounts mention that in informal settings or when working late into the night, he would let the powder fade and his natural colour would show through. His eyes were his most striking feature. Multiple people who met Hamilton commented on his eyes. They were described as blue, as violet, even as a pale lavender depending on the light. They were penetrating, intense, the eyes of someone who was always analysing, always thinking 3 steps ahead. When Hamilton looked at you, people said, he really looked at you, as though he could see through polite social masks to the person beneath. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a prominent nose. He was considered handsome by the standards of his time, though not in the classical sense. His attractiveness came more from animation and intelligence than from regular features. When he was engaged in conversation, when he was arguing a point or explaining an idea, his face became extraordinarily expressive. His eyes would flash, his hands would move to emphasize points, his entire being would focus on the topic at hand. But in repose, when his mind was elsewhere, his face could look almost haggard, lined beyond his years by stress and insufficient sleep. Hamilton's daily routine during his years in government service was punishing. He would rise before dawn, typically around 5 in the morning, sometimes earlier if he had particular work to complete. He would dress quickly, always meticulously, in the formal attire expected of a gentleman and government official. Breeches, stockings, waistcoat, coat, all precisely fitted despite his modest income. Hamilton understood that appearance mattered, that to be taken seriously in a society that judged by surface presentation, he needed to look the part of the statesman he claimed to be. His morning routine was spare, a quick breakfast, perhaps bread and coffee, eaten while he read correspondence or newspapers. He would spend the first hours of the day, before the city fully awoke, writing. This was when his mind was sharpest, when he could think without interruption. During his time as Treasury Secretary, he would draft reports, compose letters, work through complex financial calculations, all in these quiet morning hours before the demands of the office crowded in. His handwriting was small, precise, remarkably consistent even when he was writing at great speed. Pages of Hamilton's correspondence survive, and they show a hand that was both rapid and legible, covering pages with arguments and calculations without apparent correction or hesitation. He seems to have composed directly onto the page, thinking and writing simultaneously, rarely needing to revise. By 8 or 9 in the morning, he would be at his office in the Treasury building, a small cramped space that he would occupy for hours. He worked at a standing desk, pacing while he thought, dictating letters to clerks, reviewing accounts, meeting with merchants and bankers who needed government decisions, dealing with the endless administrative details of running a new government department that was essentially inventing its procedures as it went along. His work style was intense, focused to the point of obsession. When Hamilton was engaged with a problem, he would pursue it relentlessly until he understood it completely. He demanded the same focus from his subordinates at Treasury. Clerks who worked for him described a man who expected excellence, who would return documents covered with corrections if they contained errors, who noticed every discrepancy in accounts, every imprecise phrase in correspondence. He was not cruel, but he was exacting. He had no patience for sloppiness or laziness. At the same time, he could be extraordinarily generous to subordinates who met his standards. He would take time to explain complex points to clerks who wanted to learn, would recommend promising young men for advancement, would write letters of introduction for people he thought deserved opportunities. Lunch, when he took it at all, was brief and functional. Often he would eat at his desk, a piece of bread or cold meat, barely tasting it, his mind still on whatever problem he was working through. In later years, Eliza would pack him food and send it to his office, because she knew he would otherwise forget to eat entirely. Afternoons were consumed with meetings. Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, had to deal with congressmen seeking explanations of policy, with Washington, who wanted briefings on financial matters, with foreign diplomats who had questions about American credit, with state governors who were affected by federal fiscal policy. He was articulate in these meetings, able to explain complex financial concepts in terms that non-experts could understand. But he could also be impatient with those he considered stupid or deliberately obstructive. If someone asked a question Hamilton thought was foolish, his contempt was barely concealed. If someone opposed his policies for what Hamilton considered political rather than principled reasons, he could be scathing. This inability to suffer fools gladly, this tendency to show his intellectual superiority, made him enemies. People who might have been neutral allies were alienated by Hamilton's arrogance. It was one of his great weaknesses, this inability to pretend respect for people he did not respect. Evening was when Hamilton returned home, though home, during his government service years, was often whatever temporary lodging he and Eliza had secured in Philadelphia or New York. The family would dine together if Hamilton was not detained by work, which was rare. He was a distant father in many ways, affectionate when present, but often absent in mind even when physically there. His children would try to engage him in conversation about their days, and he would respond with distracted kindness, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. After dinner he would return to his study and work until midnight or later. This was when he wrote his public essays, his newspaper articles defending administration policies, his drafts of legislation for friendly congressmen to introduce. The house would grow quiet, Eliza and the children would go to bed, and Hamilton would remain at his desk, candles burning down, writing page after page in his careful small hand. He drank coffee to stay awake, sometimes wine, though he was never a heavy drinker. His vices, such as they were work and ambition, not alcohol or gambling, or the other temptations that consumed some of his contemporaries. Sleep came late and was brief, 4 or 5 hours on average, sometimes less if a crisis demanded attention. Hamilton seems to have required less sleep than most people, or perhaps he had simply trained himself to function on insufficient rest. Either way, the pattern was unsustainable over decades, and it showed in his appearance as he aged. By his 40s, he looked older than his years, his face lined, his body thin to the point of frailty. In social settings, at the dinner parties and receptions that were essential to political life in the capital, Hamilton could be charming when he chose to be. He had wit, could tell stories about the war years, could discuss literature and philosophy with educated guests. Women often found him attractive, drawn to his intensity and intelligence. He flirted, sometimes dangerously as the Reynolds affair would prove, though mostly he kept his attraction to women under control. Men were more divided in their response to Hamilton. Those who respected intelligence and competence often became devoted admirers. Those who valued birth and social position over merit resented this upstart immigrant. Those who disagreed with his politics often found him insufferable, too certain of his own correctness, too dismissive of opposing views. Hamilton's relationship with money was complicated. He handled vast sums as Treasury Secretary, making decisions that made or broke fortunes. Yet he remained relatively poor his entire life. His government salary was modest, barely adequate to support his growing family. He refused to use his position to enrich himself, turned down opportunities that would have been perfectly legal, but that he considered unethical conflicts of interest. He could have made a fortune through insider knowledge of government financial policy. He did not. When he returned to private practice as a lawyer after leaving Treasury, he made good money, but he spent it as quickly as he earned it. The house called the Grange that he built in his later years was expensive, beyond what he could really afford. He educated his children well, spending money he did not have to give them opportunities. He was always in debt, always struggling to meet expenses despite being one of the most capable financial minds in America. The contradiction speaks to something fundamental in Hamilton's character. He understood money in the abstract as a tool of national policy, as a mechanism for organising economic activity. But on a personal level, he never cared much about accumulating wealth. What he wanted was respect, influence, the ability to shape events. Money was necessary for respectability, but it was never an end in itself. Hamilton's reading habits reveal the scope of his intellectual interests. He read constantly, in multiple languages. English primarily, but also French, which he had learned from his mother, and Latin, which he had taught himself. He read political philosophy, Hume and Locke and Montesquieu, absorbing their theories about government and applying them to American circumstances. He read military history, studying the campaigns of ancient and modern generals, looking for principles that could guide strategic thinking. He read economics, such as it existed as a discipline in the late 18th century, studying the work of Adam Smith and the French physiocrats, extracting ideas about trade and finance. He read contemporary newspapers voraciously, following political debates, noting arguments that needed to be answered. His reading was always purposeful, always in service of whatever project he was currently engaged with. He didn't read for pleasure in the way some people did. He read to learn, to find ammunition for his arguments, to understand his opponents better. His relationships with other founders were complex and often contentious. With Washington, he had something close to a father-son bond, though the breach in 1781 scarred both of them. Washington valued Hamilton's intellect, but was sometimes troubled by his arrogance and impulsiveness. Hamilton revered Washington but chafed under his authority, wanting more independence than Washington was willing to grant. After Hamilton left Washington's staff, they remained connected, with Washington calling on Hamilton for advice throughout his presidency. But the warmth of the early years never fully returned. With Jefferson, the relationship was poisonous from the start. They were opposites in almost every way. Jefferson tall, Hamilton short, Jefferson languid in manner, Hamilton intense. Jefferson valuing agricultural virtue, Hamilton promoting commercial development. Jefferson believing in strict construction of the Constitution, Hamilton arguing for broad implied powers. Their mutual hatred was so visceral that they could barely stand to be in the same room. Cabinet meetings during Washington's administration, when both were present, were reportedly tense to the point of explosion. With Madison, the relationship was tragic. They had been allies during the fight for the Constitution, had collaborated on the Federalist Papers, had worked together for ratification. But once the new government began operating and policy questions had to be resolved in practice rather than theory, they split irreconcilably. Madison sided with Jefferson in opposition to Hamilton's financial system. Hamilton never forgave what he saw as Madison's betrayal. With Adams, Hamilton's relationship was one of barely concealed contempt on both sides. Adams thought Hamilton was an upstart intriguer with dangerous monarchical tendencies. Hamilton thought Adams was a vain fool whose vanity made him unsuited for high office. Their conflict within the Federalist Party contributed to its eventual collapse. Hamilton's speaking style, both in private conversation and in public address, was characterized by precision and intensity. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling out faster than some listeners could follow. His mind worked so rapidly that his speech sometimes struggled to keep pace with his thoughts. In formal settings, at conventions or courts, he could be extraordinarily eloquent, building arguments with logical precision, anticipating objections and answering them before they could be voiced. But in casual conversation, he could be impatient, interrupting people who spoke too slowly, finishing other people's sentences, jumping ahead to conclusions before his interlocutor had finished establishing premises. This made him effective in debate, but exhausting as a companion. Hamilton's temper was legendary among those who knew him. He could be cold and cutting when angry, using his verbal skills to demolish opponents. He held grudges, remembering slights for years and repaying them when opportunity arose. Yet he could also be generous and forgiving to those who admitted error or showed genuine remorse. His anger was not petty or small-minded. It was the anger of someone who cared intensely about principles and felt personally affronted when those principles were violated. In his personal habits, Hamilton was fastidious to the point of compulsiveness. His dress was always immaculate. His papers were organized with military precision. His accounts, personal and professional, were kept in meticulous order. He could not tolerate disorder or sloppiness in any aspect of his life. This need for control, for organization, for precision, was perhaps a reaction to the chaos of his early life. Having grown up with no control over his circumstances, having survived abandonment and destitution and social exclusion, he created in his adult life a world of perfect order that he could manage through sheer force of will. His health was never robust. He suffered from various ailments throughout his adult life: migraines, digestive troubles, periods of exhaustion that suggest what we might now recognize as burnout. He drove himself so hard that his body repeatedly broke down under the strain, yet he would recover and immediately resume his punishing schedule, unable or unwilling to moderate his pace. Eliza worried constantly about his health, tried to get him to rest, to eat properly, to take breaks from work. He would agree and then immediately violate whatever promises he'd made, pulled back into work by his own inability to do anything at less than full intensity. This then was Alexander Hamilton in life, not the legend or the historical figure, but the actual man who walked through the streets of New York and Philadelphia at the turn of the 19th century. Brilliant and flawed, generous and arrogant, principled and scheming, loving and cold, building and destroying all at once. A man of extraordinary gifts and ordinary weaknesses, whose virtues and vices were equally outsized. This is the man who created the American financial system, who wrote much of the constitutional foundation, who helped birth a nation, and then could not step back from the political battles that destroyed him. This is the man who went to Weehawken on a summer morning to throw his life away for honour, and now, having paused to understand who he was, we can return to his story and watch it move toward its tragic conclusion. But he was more than a secretary. Washington relied on Hamilton for strategic advice, for political analysis, for understanding the economic and financial dimensions of the war. Hamilton attended strategy sessions with the senior officers. He was present at the great battles, carrying orders to commanders under fire. At Monmouth in June 1778, Hamilton rode through heavy combat, delivering Washington's commands during the confused fight that ended in stalemate. At Yorktown in October 1781, he would lead troops in a nighttime assault that helped seal British defeat. But mostly, Hamilton was at that desk, writing. He drafted Washington's response to the Conway Cabal, the attempt by some officers and congressmen to replace Washington with Horatio Gates. He wrote the letters that maintained the tenuous relationship between the Army and Congress, as that relationship repeatedly threatened to collapse over lack of pay and supplies. He helped Washington navigate the delicate politics of the French alliance after France entered the war in 1778, He learned statecraft by doing it, absorbing how power worked, how alliances were managed, how to persuade through words when force was unavailable. During these years, Hamilton also found time to write for public consumption. In 1779 and 1780, he published a series of essays analysing the economic and financial crisis facing the new nation. These letters, written under the pseudonym Publius, argued that America needed a strong central government with the power to tax and regulate commerce. The Continental Congress, Hamilton argued, was too weak. The Articles of Confederation, just then being debated, did not give the national government enough authority. America would either create real federal power or dissolve into chaos. These were not popular views. Most Americans in 1780 feared centralized authority, having just fought a war to escape it. But Hamilton was already thinking past the Revolution to the problem of building a functioning nation. He was 23 or 25 years old, writing economic theory in stolen hours while serving as Washington's aide during an ongoing war. In December 1780, Hamilton travelled to Albany, New York on a mission for Washington. While there, he met Elizabeth Schuyler, the daughter of Philip Schuyler, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in New York. Schuyler was a major general in the Continental Army, a patron of vast estates in the Hudson Valley, and a member of one of New York's most prominent families. His daughter Eliza was 23, intelligent, well-educated, and by all accounts warm and kind. Hamilton, who had charm to match his intellect, courted her with intensity. They were married on December 14th, 1780. The marriage transformed Hamilton's social position. He was no longer a bastard from nowhere. He was now connected to New York's aristocracy by marriage, giving him the social standing his ability deserved but his birth had denied. Eliza would be his partner for the rest of his life, bearing him 8 children and supporting him through triumphs and scandals with unwavering loyalty. But Hamilton's relationship with Washington, the other great relationship of his life, was about to fracture. In February 1781, at headquarters in New Windsor, New York, Hamilton and Washington had a confrontation that ended their working relationship. The details are recorded in Hamilton's own account. Washington asked Hamilton to come to his office for a discussion. Hamilton, on his way upstairs, encountered the French General Lafayette on the stairs and stopped to talk for a minute or two. When he reached Washington's office, the general was furious. "Colonel Hamilton," Washington said coldly, "you have kept me waiting at the head of the stairs these 10 minutes. I must tell you, sir, you treat me with disrespect." Hamilton, exhausted from 4 years of intense labour and resenting what he felt was Washington's high-handedness, replied with equal coldness, "I am not conscious of it, sir, but since you have thought it necessary to tell me so, we part." Washington, perhaps shocked by this response, said, "Very well, sir, if it be your choice." It was a trivial incident, the kind of minor friction that happens in any working relationship. But Hamilton had been looking for an excuse to leave. He wanted a field command, a chance to win glory in combat rather than remaining at a desk. He felt he had earned the right to leave staff work and lead troops. Washington, who valued Hamilton's abilities too much to let him go easily, tried to reconcile the next day. But Hamilton, stubborn and proud, refused. He agreed to continue working until Washington could find a replacement, but the close relationship was over. By April 1781, Hamilton had left Washington's staff. He spent the summer in Albany with Eliza, studying law and hoping for a field command. When Washington's army began moving south toward Virginia that fall, Hamilton wrote repeatedly begging for a combat command. Washington, who had never stopped valuing Hamilton despite their breach, finally agreed. At the siege of Yorktown in October 1781, Hamilton was given command of a light infantry battalion with orders to assault a key British fortification, Redoubt No. 10. On the night of October 14th, 1781, Hamilton led his men in a bayonet assault against the fortified position. His orders were to take the redoubt without firing their muskets, using only bayonets to maintain surprise. The assault succeeded in less than 10 minutes with minimal American casualties. Hamilton had finally won his moment of military glory. 4 days later, British General Cornwallis surrendered his army, effectively ending the Revolutionary War. Hamilton had served in the war from its first days to its last major action. He had been Washington's primary aide for 4 crucial years. He had proven himself as both a staff officer and a combat commander. He was 24 or 26 years old, and he had helped win a revolution. But winning the revolution, as Hamilton understood better than most, was only the first step. Now came the harder task of building a nation that could survive. Hamilton returned to civilian life in 1782, settling with Eliza in Albany, where he passed the bar examination and opened a law practice. He had studied law intensively during the war, reading every legal text he could acquire, and his natural intellectual gifts allowed him to master the material quickly. Within months, he had established himself as one of New York's most effective lawyers, particularly skilled at arguing complex commercial cases. His practice thrived. His clients included merchants, bankers, and landowners who needed someone who understood both law and finance. Hamilton had an uncanny ability to see through to the heart of legal questions, to find the precedent or principle that decided a case. He could think faster than opposing counsel, write more persuasively, and argue more forcefully. He was not personally warm. Contemporary accounts describe him as reserved, even cold, in his professional manner. But he was brilliant, and in the law, brilliance was currency. In 1782 he was appointed as a Continental Congressman from New York, serving a 1-year term in the Congress that met in Philadelphia. It was his first direct experience with national politics, and it confirmed his worst fears about the weakness of the central government under the Articles of Confederation. Congress had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, no real authority to govern. The states, jealous of their sovereignty, refused to fund the national government adequately. The war debt was enormous, the army unpaid, the nation's credit destroyed. Hamilton watched in frustration as Congress begged states for money and was ignored. He proposed measures to give Congress power to levy import duties, arguing that the national government needed independent revenue. He was voted down by delegates who feared any increase in central authority. He wrote letters to influential men, trying to build support for constitutional reform. He argued in Congress for a stronger executive, for a national bank, for a professional military establishment. He was too far ahead of the prevailing sentiment. Most Americans in the 1780s wanted less government, not more. Hamilton left Congress in 1783 disgusted with its impotence. He returned to his law practice in New York, which had just been evacuated by the British and was returning to American control. He defended loyalists whose property had been confiscated by the state, arguing in court that treaties made by the national government superseded state laws. This was not a popular position. Many New Yorkers wanted revenge on loyalists who had sided with Britain, but Hamilton argued on principle. If the United States was to be a nation of laws, then treaties must be honoured and property rights respected regardless of political sentiment. His most famous case from this period was Rutgers versus Waddington in 1784, where he defended a loyalist brewer against a claim for damages by a patriot whose property the brewer had used during British occupation. Hamilton argued that the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, prevented punishment of loyalists for actions taken during the conflict. The court, in a decision that helped establish the principle of judicial review, ruled partially in Hamilton's favour, finding that treaty obligations limited state authority. Through these years, Hamilton's life took on a pattern that would persist for the next 2 decades. He worked obsessively, sleeping little, writing constantly. His law practice made him wealthy by the standards of the time, though never as wealthy as the landed families like the Schuylers or the Livingstons. Eliza ran their household, managed their growing family, and provided the stable domestic foundation that Hamilton, given his rootless early life, had never experienced. They moved to New York City in 1783, establishing themselves in a house on Wall Street. Hamilton joined political societies, wrote pamphlets, and argued in court. He was building a reputation as one of the most intelligent and capable men in New York. But he was not content. The nation was in crisis. The states quarrelled with each other over trade and territory. The Congress was powerless. The war debt was unpaid, credit was destroyed, and there was no unified commercial policy. Most troubling to Hamilton, there was no vision for what America might become. The Revolution had been fought to escape British rule, but no one had successfully answered the question of what would replace it. In 1786, a small constitutional convention met in Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss commercial issues between the states. Hamilton attended as a delegate from New York. The convention accomplished little, but it did issue a call, largely drafted by Hamilton, for a larger convention to meet in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation and create a more effective system of government. When that convention met in May 1787, Hamilton was there. He was 30 or 32 years old, one of the youngest delegates. He did not dominate the proceedings the way Madison or Franklin or Washington did. He gave one very long speech proposing a system of government so centralized that it horrified even those who agreed that the articles were inadequate. Hamilton argued for a president and senators elected for life, for a national government that could veto state laws, essentially for something close to a constitutional monarchy without the monarchy. His proposal went nowhere. Even Hamilton's allies recognized it was too extreme. But when the convention produced the Constitution, a document that created a far stronger national government than had existed under the Articles, Hamilton became its most effective advocate. Along with Madison and Jay, he wrote the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 essays arguing for ratification of the Constitution. Hamilton wrote 51 of the 85 essays, an astonishing output produced in less than a year, while he was also maintaining his law practice and participating in New York's ratification debates. The Federalist Papers remain the most authoritative interpretation of the Constitution's meaning and intent. They are read by law students, cited by Supreme Court justices, and studied by anyone trying to understand the American system of government. And 51 of them came from Hamilton's pen, written in the evenings and early mornings, drafted on his lap while riding in carriages between New York and Albany, composed with such speed that the printer often waited for Hamilton to finish sections before the next issue of the newspaper could go to press. Federalist 78, written by Hamilton, established the argument for judicial review, the power of courts to strike down unconstitutional laws. Federalist 70 through 77 defended the strong executive created by the Constitution. Federalist 30 through 36 argued for federal taxing power. These were not dry legal documents. They were passionate, logical, historically informed arguments for a new kind of government, a republic that would be energetic and effective while remaining accountable to the people. When New York's ratification convention met in Poughkeepsie in June 1788, Hamilton led the fight for approval. New York was deeply divided. The rural areas opposed the Constitution, fearing it gave too much power to the central government and would benefit commercial interests at the expense of farmers. Hamilton argued, debated, cajoled, and eventually, by the narrowest margin, New York ratified. The Constitution was adopted. The new government began operations in 1789 with George Washington as president. Washington, who understood Hamilton's abilities and had long since forgiven their wartime breach, asked him to serve as Secretary of the Treasury. It was the offer Hamilton had been waiting for. At age 32 or 34, Alexander Hamilton became the nation's first Treasury Secretary and immediately set about creating an American financial system from nothing. Hamilton's achievements as Secretary of the Treasury are so fundamental to American government that it is difficult now to see how revolutionary they were at the time. He walked into office in September 1789 and found not a financial system but chaos. The nation owed approximately $75 million, an enormous sum for the time, to foreign governments and domestic creditors. There was no way to pay it. The states owed similar amounts. There was no national currency. The Congress had no reliable revenue source. Trade was irregular. Financial instruments were traded at fractions of their face value because no one believed they would ever be redeemed. Foreign nations considered American credit worthless. Within months of taking office, Hamilton submitted his first report on the public credit to Congress. It was a comprehensive plan to establish American financial credibility. First, the federal government would assume full responsibility for all war debts, both national and state. This was controversial. States that had already paid their debts opposed assuming the debts of states that had not. But Hamilton argued that the war was a collective effort, and the debt should be a collective responsibility. Second, the debt would be paid at full value. Speculators who had bought government bonds at deep discounts would be paid in full. This was even more controversial. Many argued that the original holders, soldiers and citizens who'd been forced to sell their bonds for pennies on the dollar, should be compensated. But Hamilton countered that establishing full faith and credit required honouring obligations as written, regardless of who currently held them. Third, the federal government would establish reliable revenue streams through tariffs and excise taxes to service the debt. Fourth, and most radical, Hamilton proposed creating a national bank, the Bank of the United States, modelled on the Bank of England, that would stabilise currency, provide credit, and serve as the government's financial agent. The battles over these proposals consumed the next 2 years. Jefferson and Madison opposed the bank, arguing it was unconstitutional. The Constitution did not explicitly grant Congress power to create a bank. Hamilton wrote a brilliant defense of implied powers, arguing that the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution gave Congress authority to create institutions needed to carry out its explicit powers. Congress had the power to regulate currency and credit, therefore it could create a bank to do so. Washington, convinced by Hamilton's arguments, signed the bill creating the Bank of the United States in February 1791. Hamilton's debt assumption plan passed only after a famous political deal. Jefferson and Madison agreed to support assumption in exchange for Hamilton supporting the relocation of the nation's capital from New York to a site on the Potomac River, the future Washington, D.C. It was backroom politics at its most pragmatic, and it worked. By 1791, Hamilton had created the structure of American public finance. There was a national bank, funded debt, reliable revenue streams, and a system for managing credit. Foreign nations began lending to the United States again. American bonds traded at par value. Commerce expanded because merchants could obtain credit. It was an astonishing achievement, the creation of a modern financial system where none had existed. But Hamilton did not stop with financial mechanics. He had a vision for America's economic future. In his report on manufactures submitted to Congress in December 1791, he argued that the United States should deliberately encourage manufacturing through protective tariffs, subsidies to new industries, and infrastructure development. America, Hamilton believed, should not remain an agricultural nation supplying raw materials to European manufacturers. It should become an industrial power, self-sufficient and economically diverse. This report was too far ahead of its time. Congress did not adopt most of Hamilton's industrial policy. America would remain primarily agricultural for another half-century. But the blueprint was there, and when America did industrialize in the mid-19th century, it followed Hamilton's prescriptions closely. Through all this, Hamilton was working at a pace that would have destroyed most people. He was running the Treasury Department, proposing legislation, writing reports that ran to hundreds of pages, defending his policies in newspapers and in Congress, and maintaining his law practice on the side because his government salary was inadequate to support his growing family. He slept 4 or 5 hours a night, worked through weekends, and drove his subordinates at Treasury as hard as he drove himself. He was also making enemies. Jefferson and Madison, who had been allies during the fight for the Constitution, had become convinced that Hamilton's policies were creating a dangerous concentration of federal power that would replicate British-style corruption. They saw Hamilton's bank, his debt system, his support for manufacturing as tools to enrich northern merchants and speculators at the expense of southern farmers. They believed Hamilton wanted to create an American aristocracy based on money rather than land. Hamilton, for his part, viewed Jefferson and Madison as naive idealists who did not understand how government actually worked, who wanted to keep America weak and agricultural, who talked about democracy while depending on slave labor for their wealth. The philosophical divide between Hamilton and Jefferson became the foundation for America's first party system. Hamilton's Federalists believed in strong central government, commercial development, and a broad interpretation of constitutional powers. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans believed in limited federal government, agricultural expansion, and strict interpretation of the Constitution. Every political debate of the 1790s split along these lines, and the split was poisonous. Hamilton and Jefferson, both serving in Washington's cabinet, could barely stand to be in the same room. Their mutual hatred was so intense that Washington repeatedly had to mediate between them. By 1793, Jefferson had resigned as Secretary of State, partially because he could not stand working alongside Hamilton. But Hamilton's problems were about to get much worse and much more personal. In the summer of 1791, while Hamilton was building his financial system and battling Jefferson over the future of America, he made a decision that would nearly destroy him. He began an affair with Maria Reynolds, a 23-year-old woman who appeared at his home one evening claiming to need financial help. She said her husband had abandoned her. She was desperate. Could Mr. Hamilton, whose reputation for aiding those in distress was well known, help her? Hamilton, who was 34 or 36, gave her money. Then he visited her at her boarding house. Then he visited again. The affair, sordid and reckless, continued for several months. Hamilton was aware it was wrong. He was risking his marriage, his reputation, everything he had built. Yet he continued. Perhaps it was the stress of his position. Perhaps it was the thrill of transgression for a man whose entire life had been controlled, disciplined, focused. Whatever the reason, he gave Maria Reynolds money repeatedly and visited her whenever he could manufacture excuses to be away from home. Then, in December 1791, James Reynolds, Maria's husband, appeared. He had known about the affair all along. In fact, he and Maria had been running a con, targeting Hamilton deliberately because of his wealth and position. Reynolds demanded money for his silence. $1,000 initially, a huge sum. Hamilton paid. Reynolds demanded more. Hamilton kept paying. He was being blackmailed, and he knew it, but he could not stop because exposure would ruin him. The affair ended in 1792, but Reynolds continued demanding money. Hamilton finally stopped paying. Reynolds, desperate and vengeful, then tried a different tactic. He let it be known to Republican politicians that he had evidence of financial corruption by the Treasury Secretary. In December 1792, 3 congressmen, including James Monroe, confronted Hamilton with Reynolds's accusations. Hamilton, cornered, made a decision that must have cost him enormous pain. He confessed to the affair. He showed the congressmen his correspondence with Maria and James Reynolds, proving that the money he had paid was blackmail for adultery, not payment for financial corruption. The congressmen, satisfied that no official misconduct had occurred, agreed to keep the matter private. Hamilton believed the worst was over. But James Callender, a political journalist working for Jefferson and Madison, somehow obtained the Reynolds correspondence and in 1797 published it in a series of pamphlets. Hamilton's secret was now public. His wife Eliza, who had borne him 5 children and stood by him through every political battle, now knew that he had been unfaithful, that he had lied to her, that he had carried on an affair that made them both subjects of public mockery and scandal. Hamilton made another extraordinary decision. He published a 95-page pamphlet, the Reynolds pamphlet, confessing to the affair in excruciating detail while vehemently denying any financial corruption. It was an act of political suicide in service of personal honour. He admitted to adultery to prove he was not a thief. The logic was Hamilton's to the core, legally precise and emotionally devastating. The pamphlet destroyed what remained of his political standing. His Federalist allies were appalled. His enemies were delighted. Eliza somehow eventually forgave him. She never spoke publicly about the affair, never condemned him, never left him. Why she stayed, whether from love, duty, religious conviction, or economic necessity, no one can know with certainty. But she did stay. She would remain his wife for the next 7 years until his death, and then spend the next 50 years after he died defending his reputation and organising his papers. The Reynolds affair marked the beginning of Hamilton's decline. He remained Treasury Secretary until January 1795, but his effectiveness was compromised. He resigned and returned to his law practice in New York, trying to rebuild his finances and his reputation. Yet even out of office, he continued to involve himself in politics. He wrote essays, advised Federalist politicians, and tried to maintain influence over government policy. When John Adams became president in 1797, Hamilton, who thought Adams was a vain fool, worked behind the scenes to undermine him. When the election of 1800 came down to a tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr in the Electoral College, Hamilton lobbied Federalist congressmen to support Jefferson as the lesser evil. He despised Jefferson's politics, but he considered Burr completely unprincipled. Thanks in part to Hamilton's advocacy, Jefferson became president and Burr became vice president. Burr blamed Hamilton for denying him the presidency. The grudge, added to decades of smaller conflicts and mutual contempt, was now poisonous. Hamilton was 43 or 45 years old. He had created the American financial system. He had written much of the Constitution's intellectual foundation. He had served at Washington's right hand during the Revolution and War. He had been one of the most powerful men in America. Now he was a private citizen whose reputation was tarnished, whose influence was waning, whose marriage had survived infidelity but was marked by it, whose political party was fracturing and whose future was uncertain. He had always been driven by a desperate need to achieve, to matter, to overcome the stigma of his birth. But what was left to achieve? And how much more was he willing to sacrifice? The final years of Alexander Hamilton's life were marked by a growing sense that history was moving past him. He was still intellectually formidable, still writing essays on policy questions, still practicing law with great success. But the political world he had helped create was evolving in directions he could not control. Jefferson's election in 1800 represented the triumph of a vision of America fundamentally different from Hamilton's. The Federalist Party, Hamilton's vehicle for implementing his ideas, was collapsing under the weight of internal divisions and public rejection of its policies. Hamilton tried to remain relevant. He founded a newspaper, the New York Evening Post, which still exists today as the New York Post, to advocate for Federalist principles. He wrote essays attacking Jefferson's administration for what he saw as dangerous weakness in foreign policy and fiscal irresponsibility. He argued legal cases that established precedents still cited today. But he was no longer at the centre of power, no longer the indispensable man whose ideas shaped policy. His family life was also marked by tragedy. On November 20th, 1801, Hamilton's eldest son Philip, 19 years old and recently graduated from Columbia College, fought a duel to defend his father's honour against a Republican lawyer who had publicly insulted Hamilton. Philip was shot just above the right hip, the bullet fracturing his spine. He died the next day in his parents' home in agony, while Hamilton and Eliza watched helplessly. Philip had been brilliant, charming, everything Hamilton had hoped for in an heir. His death devastated both parents. Eliza suffered what appears to have been a complete mental breakdown, unable to function for months. Hamilton, who had witnessed so much death during the Revolution, who had survived his mother's death, his father's abandonment, every hardship his early life had thrown at him, was shattered by his son's death in a way nothing had shattered him before. Philip had died on the same duelling ground in Weehawken where Hamilton would die 3 years later, shot in almost exactly the same place. The coincidence, if it was coincidence, seems too cruel to be accidental. After Philip's death, the Hamilton family moved to a country house called the Grange, which Hamilton had built in Upper Manhattan far from the city. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat, a place where Eliza could recover and where the family could rebuild something like normal life. Hamilton threw himself into landscaping and planting, trying to create a gentleman's estate. He designed gardens, planted trees, and imagined a future of rural tranquility. But he could not stay away from politics. He continued writing, continued engaging in factional battles within the Federalist Party. In 1804, when Aaron Burr ran for governor of New York, Hamilton worked actively to defeat him, believing Burr was untrustworthy and dangerous. Hamilton made speeches against Burr, wrote letters attacking his character, and lobbied Federalist voters to support Burr's opponent. Burr lost the election decisively, and he blamed Hamilton for his defeat. At a dinner party in Albany that April, Hamilton made comments about Burr's character. The remarks were reported in a newspaper as Hamilton calling Burr despicable. When Burr saw the article, he had reached his limit. For years, Hamilton had attacked him publicly and privately, had blocked his political advancement, had questioned his honour. Now Burr demanded satisfaction. On June 18th, 1804, Burr wrote to Hamilton demanding an explanation for the reported insults. Hamilton's reply was evasive and legalistic. He could not recall making the specific statements reported, and even if he had, despicable was too vague a term to admit to or repudiate. The correspondence continued for weeks, each letter carefully preserving a record of the escalating conflict. Burr's seconds and Hamilton's seconds exchanged notes. Burr made clear he wanted either a retraction or a duel. Hamilton, constrained by the code of honour that governed men of his class and time, could not retract without appearing cowardly. But he also could not simply refuse to duel without destroying what remained of his reputation. He was trapped by the same system of honour he had always lived within, a system that had already cost him his son. Hamilton knew duelling was barbaric. He had publicly condemned it after Philip's death. He had supported legislation to outlaw it. Yet he could not find a way to refuse Burr's challenge without effectively ending his public life. If he refused to duel, he would be branded a coward. His opinions would carry no weight. His ability to practice law and influence politics would be destroyed. His entire life had been built on reputation, on being taken seriously, on mattering. Without that, he was nothing. The bastard from the Caribbean again, nobody's legitimate son. On July 4th, 1804, Hamilton wrote his will. He also wrote a statement explaining his decision to accept Burr's challenge while intending not to fire at Burr. He called duelling contrary to my moral and religious principles. He said he had decided to throw away his shot, to reserve his first fire, giving Burr an opportunity to fire without risk of return fire. Whether Hamilton truly intended this or whether it was post hoc justification, we cannot know. He also wrote a letter to Eliza, to be opened only if he died in the duel. The letter is heartbreaking. He apologizes for his failings as a husband. He expresses his love for her and their children. He provides instructions for managing his modest estate, which was burdened with debt. He ends with the hope that she will join him in a better world. On the morning of July 10th, Hamilton put his affairs in order. He played with his younger children. He spent the evening with Eliza and a few friends, giving no indication of what awaited him the next morning. Before dawn on July 11th, Hamilton left his home and walked to the dock where a boat was waiting to take him across the Hudson to Weehawken. His second, Judge Pendleton, and his physician, Dr. Hozak, accompanied him. The crossing took about 30 minutes. The sun had not yet risen. Burr and his party arrived separately. The duelling ground was a narrow ledge carved from the cliff face, about 20 feet wide and 40 feet long. Trees and brush screened it from the river. It was private, secluded, and illegal. Dueling was banned in both New York and New Jersey, though New Jersey's laws were less strictly enforced, which is why the duel took place there. The weapons were pistols that Hamilton had borrowed from his brother-in-law John Church. They were the same pistols that Philip Hamilton had used in his fatal duel. The seconds loaded the weapons and measured the distance 10 paces. Hamilton put on his spectacles and asked to test the trigger, claiming the light made it difficult to see clearly. He aimed at a tree, squeezed the trigger to test its resistance. Observers interpreted this as Hamilton preparing to fire accurately, but Pendleton would later claim Hamilton was only familiarizing himself with the weapon he intended not to use. At the signal, Burr raised his pistol, aimed, and fired with smooth deliberation. Hamilton's pistol discharged a moment later, the ball flying harmlessly upward into the trees. Hamilton fell. The bullet had entered just above his right hip, passed through his liver and kidney, and lodged in his spine. Dr. Hozak rushed forward and found Hamilton conscious but in shock. Hamilton said, "This is a mortal wound." He briefly lost consciousness as Hozak and Pendleton carried him to the boat. Burr started toward Hamilton but was urged away by his second to avoid any appearance that might later be used against him. Burr and his party left the scene quickly. Hamilton was rowed back across the Hudson. Word spread through Manhattan that the former Treasury Secretary had been shot in a duel. By the time Hamilton reached his home on Jane Street, a crowd had gathered. Eliza met him at the door. She had not known he was dueling. Seeing him carried in on a stretcher, seeing the blood, she understood immediately. For 31 hours, Hamilton lingered. The bullet had severed his spinal cord, paralyzing him from the waist down. The internal damage was catastrophic. He was given laudanum for pain. Physicians came and went, powerless to save him. Friends visited to pay their respects. He asked repeatedly about Burr, expressing concern for his safety from mob violence. He received communion from Bishop Benjamin Moore of the Episcopal Church. He spent time with his children, trying to comfort them. He told Eliza again and again that he loved her, that she had been the best wife any man could want. At 2 p.m. on July 12, 1804, surrounded by his family, Alexander Hamilton died. He was 47 or 49 years old. News of Hamilton's death produced an outpouring of public grief unprecedented in the young nation's history. The man who'd been controversial in life, who had been attacked and ridiculed, who had lost political power and social standing through scandal, became in death a martyr to Federalist principles. His funeral on July 14th was attended by thousands. Businesses closed, flags flew at half-mast, church bells tolled throughout the city. The funeral procession stretched for blocks. Gouverneur Morris, a fellow Federalist who had sometimes opposed Hamilton's policies, delivered the eulogy. He praised Hamilton's genius, his service to the nation, and his tragic end. The newspapers that had attacked Hamilton when he lived now published tributes to his brilliance. Even Jefferson, hearing of Hamilton's death, acknowledged his abilities while maintaining his opposition to Hamilton's politics. Aaron Burr was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, though he was never tried. His political career was destroyed. He fled south to avoid arrest, spent years in dubious schemes involving Western territories, and died in 1836, old, impoverished, and largely forgotten. He had killed the famous Alexander Hamilton, and in doing so had killed his own future. Hamilton was buried in the graveyard of Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan, the church whose steeple had been visible from his childhood home on the Caribbean islands, where he had dreamed of escape and greatness. His gravestone, paid for by subscription from friends and supporters because his own estate was too encumbered with debt, bore a simple inscription with his name, dates, and titles. Eliza Hamilton would live another 50 years, until 1854. She devoted much of that time to preserving her husband's legacy, organizing his papers, commissioning his biography, and establishing charitable institutions in his name. She forgave him his infidelities, forgave his pride that led him to Weehawken, forgave him for leaving her widowed with 7 children and mountains of debt. Whether she could forgive him, or simply chose to remember him as he wished to be remembered, we cannot know. But she worked tirelessly to ensure he would be remembered as a founder, as a genius, as the architect of American financial power. The legacy of Alexander Hamilton is woven so deeply into the fabric of American life that it is difficult to see clearly. Begin with the obvious: the financial system Hamilton created, the assumption of state debts, the establishment of federal credit, the creation of a national bank. These became the model for how modern nations manage public finance. The Bank of the United States did not survive in its original form, but the principle that government needs sophisticated financial institutions became fundamental. When the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, it was essentially Hamilton's vision implemented with 20th century mechanisms. Hamilton's constitutional arguments about implied powers, about the necessary and proper clause, about federal authority versus state sovereignty, these shaped how the Constitution has been interpreted for over 2 centuries. His defense of the national bank established the principle that Congress has powers beyond those explicitly listed in the Constitution. This doctrine, expanded by John Marshall's Supreme Court, allowed the federal government to grow into the institution Hamilton had envisioned. His vision for American economic development, his argument that the United States should encourage manufacturing and become an industrial power, was rejected in his lifetime but adopted wholesale in the 19th century. the protective tariffs, the infrastructure investments, the government support for emerging industries that powered American industrialization were all policies Hamilton had advocated in his report on manufactures. His understanding that a nation's power rests on its economic strength, that financial credibility is as important as military force. These insights seem obvious now, but were revolutionary in the 1790s. Hamilton saw that America could not remain an agricultural republic dependent on European manufacturers. He saw that the United States needed financial sophistication, industrial capacity, and commercial networks to become truly independent and powerful. He was correct, and American history from the 1790s through the 20th century is in many ways the implementation of Hamilton's economic vision. His work as Washington's aide established the role of presidential staff. The modern White House staff system, with chiefs of staff and senior advisors who speak with presidential authority, descends directly from Hamilton's position as Washington's primary aide-de-camp. He showed that a president needed sophisticated staff who could analyze, draft, and implement policy. The Federalist Papers remain the most authoritative explanation of constitutional design. They are cited in Supreme Court decisions, taught in law schools and political science departments, and read by anyone trying to understand the American system of government. And 51 of 85 were written by Hamilton in stolen hours while practicing law and serving as Treasury Secretary, written at such speed that printers waited for pages while Hamilton drafted. His writings on executive power, on the role of the judiciary, on the relationship between state and federal government, these shaped how Americans understand their political system. Beyond specific policies, Hamilton represented a particular vision of America. He believed in merit over birth, in energy over caution, in building rather than preserving. He was an immigrant who became a founder, proof that in America, your origins need not determine your future. His life embodied the idea that intelligence, work, and ambition could overcome any starting disadvantage. This idea that America is a place where you can invent yourself, where your abilities matter more than your parentage, is perhaps Hamilton's deepest legacy. He lived it, proved it, and died believing it. The darkness is that Hamilton's vision was not extended to everyone. He opposed slavery, yet he benefited from a commercial system built on slave labor. His financial system enriched northern merchants while depending on southern plantation wealth. He married into a slave-owning family and managed enslaved people on behalf of his in-laws. His vision of American greatness did not fully extend to the enslaved Africans whose labor made that greatness possible. This contradiction, visible in Hamilton's life as in the lives of most founders, reminds us that even brilliant visions are constrained by their time. Hamilton also showed the dangers of his virtues taken to extremes. His intelligence could become arrogance, his energy could become recklessness, his need for honor could become self-destructive pride, his inability to back down, his willingness to risk everything rather than appear weak. These tendencies that made him effective also destroyed him. He could have refused the duel with Burr. He could have found a way to defuse the conflict, to apologize, to walk away. But he could not. The code of honor that governed his class, combined with his personal need to be respected, to be taken seriously, to matter, drove him to that ledge in Weehawken. He threw away his family's security, his wife's happiness, his children's future for honor. It was tragic, stupid, and utterly human. Nearly 220 years after his death, Alexander Hamilton remains a figure of fascination. A 2015 Broadway musical bearing his name became one of the most successful theatrical productions in history, introducing Hamilton's story to millions who had never heard of him beyond the face on the $10 bill. The musical's genius was recognizing that Hamilton's story The immigrant who arrives with nothing and makes himself through talent and work is fundamentally American. It resonates because it represents the country's best image of itself, regardless of how often that image is contradicted by reality. Hamilton's face appears on the $10 bill, a fitting tribute for the man who created the currency and the bank that issues it. There have been periodic proposals to remove him, to replace him with a woman or a person of colour, and these proposals have merit. The currency should represent the nation's diversity. But Hamilton's defenders argue that of all the faces on American money, his might be the most appropriate. He understood money, credit, and financial power better than any founder. He built the system that makes the currency possible. If any founder deserves to be on money, it is Hamilton. Historians continue to debate his legacy, to argue about whether his vision for America was liberating or oppressive, whether his financial system empowered citizens or enriched elites. These debates matter because Hamilton's ideas still shape policy. Arguments about the size and role of the federal government, about financial regulation, about American economic policy. These are echoes of the debates Hamilton had with Jefferson, Madison, and Adams in the 1790s. Those debates have never been resolved because they reflect fundamental tensions about what America should be. Hamilton wanted a powerful nation with a strong central government that could act decisively in commerce and military affairs. His opponents wanted a decentralized nation that preserved individual liberty and state sovereignty. America has never chosen one vision entirely over the other. It remains divided, as it was in Hamilton's time, between Hamiltonian nationalism and Jeffersonian localism. This tension is not a bug in the American system. It is a feature, perhaps the defining feature. And it began with the battles Hamilton fought. What remains most striking about Hamilton's life is the sheer improbability of it. That a bastard boy from a forgotten island, orphaned at 11 or 13, with no family wealth, no social connections, no legal standing, could arrive in America as a teenager, and within 20 years become one of the most powerful men in the new nation. This should not have been possible. That he could learn law without formal training, master military affairs without military education, understand finance without business experience, write constitutional theory without academic background. All of this through reading, thinking, and relentless work stretches plausibility. That he could create institutions that endure for centuries, that he could shape the development of a nation, that he could go from nothing to indispensable, this seems like myth. Yet, it happened. The documents survive. The letters he wrote, the reports he submitted, the essays he published, the policies he implemented, these are real. Alexander Hamilton was real, not myth, though his life has the quality of myth. And perhaps that is the final legacy. Not the financial system or the constitutional arguments or the political theories, but the story itself. The story of someone who refused to accept the limitations of birth, who clawed his way from poverty to power through intelligence and work, who helped build a nation from ruins, who fell as dramatically as he rose. It is a story about what one person with genius and ambition and impossible drive can achieve. It is also a story about the price of that achievement, the personal costs, the moral compromises, the ultimate self-destruction. Hamilton won everything and lost everything. He helped create a nation that outlasted him by centuries. He left a wife and children to struggle in the poverty he had spent his life trying to escape. He died for honour, that most abstract and useless of reasons. In the end, perhaps the most important question about Alexander Hamilton is not what he achieved, but what he represents. Does his life prove that America is a place where merit triumphs over birth? Or does it prove that even extraordinary merit must navigate systems of power that favour the already powerful? Does his immigrant success validate American ideals? Or does it exist as exception rather than rule? One improbable story used to justify a system that rarely allows such stories. These questions have no single answer. Hamilton's life supports multiple interpretations, which is why it remains endlessly fascinating. He was complicated, contradictory, brilliant, flawed, visionary, and human. He matters not because he was perfect, but because he was real, and because what he built proved real enough to last. In a small graveyard in Lower Manhattan, between Broadway and Wall Street, surrounded by the financial towers that represent everything Hamilton dreamed America could become, his grave remains. The stone is worn but legible. The dates mark a life barely past middle age. Tourists visit, leaving flowers and coins. The grave of Aaron Burr, his killer, lies in Princeton, rarely visited, largely forgotten. Hamilton triumphed in death as Burr could never triumph in life. But that triumph is cold comfort for the man who died in agony, who left his family in anguish, who threw away his future for reasons he himself called foolish. The story of Alexander Hamilton ends on a cliff above the Hudson River at dawn, ends with a bullet and blood and 31 hours of dying. It ends with Eliza's grief, with children left fatherless, with plans unfinished and words unwritten. It ends badly. Yet it also ends with a nation changed, with institutions built, with ideas planted that would grow for centuries. Hamilton helped create something larger than himself, larger than his flaws, larger than his death. That is what founders do, at their best. They build beyond their lives. Hamilton built well. The structures he erected, financial, constitutional, philosophical, endure. And perhaps that must be enough. Perhaps it is all anyone can ask, to build something that lasts, to change the world in ways that persist after you're gone, to matter despite your origins, despite your mistakes, despite everything that tries to stop you. Alexander Hamilton, bastard, orphan, immigrant, founder, he was all of these. He remains all of these. His shadow is long, and we still live in it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of one of America's most brilliant and complicated founders. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Good night.